The sniper's bullet caught the convoy commander in the throat at 1,847 meters, and Staff Sergeant Lena Wycroft smiled. She watched through the spotting scope as the vehicle swerved off the mountain road, the radio she'd been monitoring erupting in panic Pashto. 3 weeks she'd waited in that hide, eating cold rations and urinating into a bag, watching that particular commander move his fighters through the Korengal Valley like he owned it. He'd killed 9 Americans in 4 months. Now he was bleeding out in the dirt while his men ran in 4 different directions, trying to figure out where the shot had come from. They never would. She was already packing. 6 hours later, Wycroft sat in the forward operating base at Kunar Province, cleaning sand from the action of her rifle, when Captain Daryl Osei walked in with a look on his face she didn't trust. "We've got a situation," he said. "We always have a situation, different kind this time." He pulled a folding chair around backward and sat like men do when they want to seem casual about something that isn't. "Command is attaching a special skills asset to the unit. Arrives tonight. She's been requested specifically for a mission next week, Objective Irongate. You're familiar." Wycroft was familiar. Irongate was the operation she'd been quietly briefing for 2 months, an attempt to extract a captured signals intelligence officer from a compound outside Asadabad. The approach terrain was a disaster. Open ground on 3 sides, a river on the 4th, and elevation all around it that made whoever controlled the high ground essentially untouchable. What kind of asset? Combat controller. Cross-trained as a forward observer. Her record says she's exceptional at close air support coordination in complex terrain. Her sergeant, first-class Talia Marsh. Comes out of Fort Bragg, 5 deployments. Osei paused, which was when Wycroft knew he was holding something back. "She's 26. Wycroft set down the cleaning rod. "Osei, she's got a file that'll make your head spin. I read it 3 times and I still don't fully understand what I was looking at. And Command is plugging her into Irongate. Why? We've been planning this for 60 days. We have contingencies. We have rehearsals. Because the contingencies aren't working and the rehearsals keep going sideways at the same choke point, and somebody at SOCOM decided that Marsh is the answer to a problem we didn't know we had until they told us we had it." He stood, tucking the chair under his arm. "She'll be here at 2200. Try to make her feel welcome." Wycroft looked at him. "Or don't," he said, and left. The rest of the team got the news by dinner. Sergeant First Class Dale Eckert, the team's senior breacher, heard it and laughed in the way people laugh when something is more insulting than funny. He'd been running operations in this province for 4 years. He had opinions about what was needed and what wasn't, and a 26-year-old controller flown in from Bragg was not on his list. "They think we can't coordinate our own fires?" he said across the table to no one in particular. "Command thinks what Command thinks," said Corporal Jerome Fitch, the youngest member of the unit, which meant he'd learned early to deflect rather than engage. "We've got Wycroft. We don't need a specialist. Wycroft does the shooting," said Sergeant Paolo Negretti. "The coordination side's a different animal. Marsh does it better than us." Eckert said it like an accusation. That's what they're implying. That's what every one of these attachments implies, that we're not good enough. Wycroft ate her food and said nothing. She'd heard variations of this speech before. She'd given it herself, once, early in her career, before she learned that being right and being loud about it were different things. Marsh arrived at 2218 hours in the back of a logistics vehicle, which was not how specialists usually made entrances. She climbed out carrying a pack that looked half her body weight, said thank you to the driver, and walked toward the operations building, which Wycroft noted. Most people, walking into a new unit for the first time, looked around. They scanned, they cataloged. Marsh walked like someone trying not to be seen, which told Wycroft several things at once, none of them what she'd expected. She was smaller than the file photo suggested. 5'4" maybe, with the economical build of someone who'd spent years making a body useful rather than impressive. Her face was younger than 26 and older at the same time, which happened to people who spent too much time outside at altitude. Wycroft intercepted her before Eckert could. "Marsh, Sergeant Wycroft, she'd done her homework." "Good. Captain Osei's not back until morning. I'll show you the layout." They walked the compound in silence for a few minutes. Wycroft didn't fill the air with unnecessary talk, and neither did Marsh, which was another data point filed away. "You've read the Irongate brief?" Wycroft asked. 3 times. "The approach problem is the ridge at grid 447. You've got a gun position there that controls the entire western route. Your current plan runs the extraction team through 500 meters of dead ground directly under that ridge. We know. I can fix it. Wycroft stopped walking. You've been here 14 minutes. I've been working this problem for 3 weeks, Marsh said. Socom pulled me off my previous assignment specifically for Iran Gate. I've had time to think. What's your solution? I need to show you on the map. It's easier to explain with the terrain model. Wycroft studied her. There was no bravado in Marsh's voice, no edge that came from needing to prove something. She spoke like someone reporting a weather condition. Flat, informational, with that particular calm that Wycroft associated with people who were very sure of what they knew and very aware of what they didn't. Operations centers this way, Wycroft said. They were at the terrain model for 2 hours. Marsh talked Wycroft through an approach she hadn't considered. Using the river as auditory cover, running the extraction team in under a coordinated fire suppression sequence that she would call in from a forward position on the eastern ridge. The grid precision required was extraordinary. The timing was tighter than anything they'd rehearsed. If Marsh miscalled a single position, rounds would land on the extraction team. You've done coordination at this kind of fidelity before? Wycroft asked. Outside coast, Fallujah twice, once in Syria that I can't talk about. A beat, and a training exercise in Norway that I'd rather not talk about for different reasons. Wycroft almost smiled. The team won't trust this plan. I know, Eckert especially. He's going to fight it. I know that too. And Marsh looked at the terrain model. And I'll explain it until they understand it, or I'll explain it until they run out of objections. Either one usually gets to the same place. The briefing the next morning went exactly as Wycroft had predicted. OC presented Marsh's revised plan. Eckert listened with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the particular way that meant he'd already decided before anyone finished talking. Negretti asked technical questions, which was his way of probing for weaknesses. Fitch kept his eyes on Wycroft, taking cues. This depends entirely on Marsh hitting 16 separate fire coordination points in sequence without error, Eckert said. Under fire. In terrain she's never physically been in. I've worked the terrain on imagery and LiDAR for 3 weeks, Marsh said. Imagery isn't the ground. No, it isn't. But my call accuracy in complex terrain is documented at 94% across 347 real-world fire missions. Silence. 984, Eckert repeated, which means 6% of the time something goes wrong, Marsh said. That's the honest answer. I won't tell you the number is higher than it is. Wycroft watched the room recalibrate slightly. People expected specialists to oversell themselves. The ones who didn't stood out. What happens in the 6%? Negretti asked. I compensate and call a correction inside 3 seconds. The rounds land, off target, I redirect, we accept the gap and adapt. She paused. The alternative is the current plan, which puts the extraction team in the dead ground under the ridge with no suppression available until they're already compromised. I've wargamed that plan 11 times. It fails 9 of them. OC looked at Eckert. Eckert looked at Marsh for a long moment. You actually think you can make 16 simultaneous fire coordination calls in that sequence, sequentially, not simultaneous. And yes, nobody does that. A few people do. It's not about talent. It's about building the spatial map before you get there. So when you're there, you're not constructing it under pressure. You're just navigating something you already built. She shrugged, a small movement. My brain works that way. It's the main thing I'm useful for. The briefing ended without resolution. Eckert pulled Wycroft into the hallway after. You believe her? Wycroft considered the question seriously, which was the only way she knew how. I believe she believes it. That's not an answer. It's the one I have. He shook his head. If she miscalls a single point, then we adapt. That's what we do. Wycroft met his eyes. Eckert, I've watched her work the terrain model for 2 hours. I've seen her call grids by memory without referencing the map. Either she's extraordinary or she's reckless enough to have survived this long by luck. And people that reckless don't usually make it to 26 with a record like hers. Eckert was quiet for a moment. I don't like it. I know. But what do you actually object to? The plan, or the fact that it came from someone who arrived 14 hours ago? He didn't answer, which was itself an answer, and they both knew it. The operation launched at 0300 hours on a Tuesday, which was when the valley usually slept deepest. Wycroft was positioned on a ridgeline 600 meters from the compound's outer wall, her job to remove any direct threats to the extraction team, while Marsh ran the fire coordination from a forward position further east. They'd be separated the entire operation, communicating only by radio, trusting each other without the ability to see what the other was seeing. Wycroft didn't love it, but she'd been in worse setups. For the first 40 minutes, nothing happened. The extraction team moved down the valley in silence, using the river's sound the way Marsh had laid it out. The compound showed no external activity. The ridge position Eckert had been so concerned about remained dark. Then Marsh's voice came through the earpiece, low and even. Ridge is activating. I count 6, possibly 8, moving to the eastern fighting position. They didn't pick up the team, their routine, but they'll have line of sight on the approach route in approximately 4 minutes. Eckert's voice, from the extraction element, can you suppress? Not without revealing the plan. If I call fire now, they know we're here. Give me 2 minutes. A pause that lasted longer than it should have. Marsh, Eckert said, 2 minutes is. I know what 2 minutes is. Give me 2 minutes. Wycroft tracked the movement on the ridge through her scope. 6 fighters moving to a prepared position, unhurried, which meant routine patrol rather than alert. Marsh was right. They hadn't been spotted. But the geometry was closing. At the 1:40 mark, Marsh said, extraction element, alter course to bearing 273 and reduce pace by 30%. I need you to move differently. That takes us off route. For 90 seconds, then I'll bring you back. Trust me. Another pause. Then Eckert, moving. The extraction team shifted. On the ridge, the fighters reached their position and settled in, scanning the valley. They scanned directly over the route the team would have been on. They saw nothing because the team wasn't there. 90 seconds later, Marsh brought them back on course, around the ridge's blind side. That was close, Fitch said, over the radio. It was planned, Marsh said. I saw that position in the imagery. I just didn't know what time they'd activate it. Wycroft filed that away. She'd said she saw it in the imagery, which meant she'd been carrying a contingency for a position she'd never confirmed was occupied as a mental backup, just in case. That was not how most people operated. The compound breach happened at 0347. Eckert's team moved in clean, which was what 4 years in country bought you. The intelligence officer, a man named Aldridge, gaunt and shaking, who'd been held for 19 days, was in the second room they cleared. Negretti had him moving within 90 seconds. That was when the compound came alive. Wycroft saw it from the ridge before anyone else. Lights coming on in the northern building, movement at 2 windows, a runner heading toward the outer wall. She took the runner. She took one of the windows. The other she couldn't reach from her angle. I have a shooter at north window, elevation 4 meters. I don't have the angle, she said. Marsh, without missing a beat. I do. Do you want the round or do you want suppression? Suppression. Don't kill him yet. I need him pinned while the team moves. Roger. What followed was something Wycroft would think about for a long time afterward. Marsh called a single fire mission. 1 round, 1 position that landed close enough to pin the shooter at the window without triggering the retreat alarm. It was a call made in seconds with precision that should have required minutes of calculation. The shooter dropped below the sill. The extraction team moved across the courtyard. Then Marsh said quietly, Wycroft, south wall, 2 coming over. Wycroft had already seen them. She engaged both before they hit the ground. The extraction was complete at 0419. The entire team reached the vehicle checkpoint without further contact. Aldridge was wrapped in a thermal blanket in the back of an MRAP, hands still shaking, asking for water in a voice that hadn't worked properly in 3 weeks. Wycroft sat in the front of the vehicle and stared at the road moving under the headlights. That single fire mission, 1 round, exactly where it needed to be. Back at the FOB, the team moved through debrief with the muted efficiency of people running on adrenaline and caffeine. OC took notes. Eckert described the breach in his methodical way. Negretti talked through the contact response. When it came to Marsh's coordination performance, a brief quiet settled over the room. 16 coordination points, OC said, looking at his notes. No errors on record. 2 unscripted adjustments, both confirmed effective. No one said anything. Eckert, OC said. Any issues with the coordination support? Eckert sat with his forearms on the table. He looked at Marsh, who was looking at the table, not at him. No, he said. No issues. Marsh looked up. That routing call at 0331, Eckert said. The bearing 273 adjustment. You'd planned for that position. I'd planned for the possibility of that position. How many contingencies were you running? For this operation? 11. The number sat in the room for a moment. Simultaneously? Negretti said, they're not all active simultaneously. It's more like having the maps loaded. You don't think about them until you need them, and then they're there. O.C. looked at Wycroft. She gave him nothing back, which he knew how to read. After debrief, the team dispersed. Wycroft found Marsh in the equipment yard doing what Wycroft herself did after operations, checking, rechecking, organizing the gear in a sequence that was really just a way to let the brain settle. She recognized the ritual. 11 contingencies? Wycroft said. Sometimes more. That's not normal. I know. Marsh folded a piece of webbing with the automatic precision of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. I used to think everyone saw terrain that way. Figured it out around age 12 that they didn't. How'd you figure it out? A pause. My dad used to take me hunting in central Montana. Elk, mostly. He'd been doing it his whole life, knew those mountains the way some people know their own kitchen. One November, we were tracking a bull across about 4 miles of broken country, and I started calling the positions before we got there. Not guessing, actually knowing where the elk had crossed, where he'd bedded, where he'd go next based on the wind shifts and the terrain breaks. She set the webbing aside. My dad stopped walking at one point and looked at me and said, "How did you know that?" And I didn't have an answer, because I didn't know it was unusual. I just assumed he saw the same things I did. Wycroft listened. He didn't say anything else about it, but the next spring he started having me call the terrain on every hunt. Like a test. I never got it wrong. She picked up the next piece of equipment. He died before I shipped for basic. Hunting accident, which is a particular kind of irony. But he used to say that reading country is something the land teaches you if you're quiet enough to listen. I think I was just born quieter than most. That's why you took the assignment. Partly. Marsh thought about it honestly. Partly I do it because it's the one thing I do where the way my brain works is useful instead of just strange. Out there tonight, that's the only time it all makes sense. Wycroft nodded slowly. She understood that in a specific way that most people wouldn't. Eckert's going to want you back, she said. He won't say it like that, but he'll find a reason to request you for the next operation. Marsh almost smiled. Is that your way of saying I did all right? It's my way of saying the plan worked. We'll see what Eckert says. What Eckert said 2 days later in the operational planning meeting for a follow-on mission was this. I want Marsh on the coordination. He said it without preamble, as if it hadn't cost him anything. Wycroft watched his face say the same thing Devlin's face had said over different terrain, in a different war, in 100 iterations of the same story. The look of a professional forced by evidence to revise what he thought he knew. It was not a look of joy. It was better than that. It was the look of someone taking something seriously. The follow-on mission was a reconnaissance of a supply route being used to move weapons into the province from the north. The terrain was worse, narrower valleys, more dead ground, elevation that made everything harder. Marsh had 4 days to build her spatial model. Wycroft watched her work, occasionally sitting across from her at the terrain table, not to help but to see. The way Marsh moved through map data was unlike anything Wycroft had seen. She didn't trace routes. She built volumes, three-dimensional shapes in her head, rotating them, testing them against variables, discarding and rebuilding. She asked questions about seasonal wind patterns in the valley that the team's intelligence package didn't address, then sourced the answers from agricultural reports filed by a provincial reconstruction team 2 years prior. She cross-referenced river flow rates against recent satellite imagery to predict which crossing points would be passable. She treated terrain like a system with logic, not a backdrop. You're not planning a route? Wycroft said one evening, watching her work. I'm planning every route, Marsh said. So when I'm there, I only have to choose. On day 3, something shifted in the team's attitude toward Marsh. Wycroft didn't see the moment it happened. These things rarely had one, but she noticed the result. Negretti started bringing Marsh coffee without being asked. Fitch began sitting near her during meals. Eckert stopped leaving the room when she started talking about terrain. It wasn't warmth, exactly. It was something soldiers understood better than warmth. Professional trust. The recognition that this person's specific way of existing in the world made you more likely to come home. The reconnaissance mission launched on a Thursday and ran over 36 hours. Marsh coordinated from a hide position she'd selected herself, 4 kilometers from the primary observation point, connected by radio and by the spatial model she'd been building for 4 days. She called terrain features, enemy movement patterns, vehicle signatures, timing intervals. A continuous stream of data that fed into OC's analysis and ultimately produced the most complete picture of that supply route anyone had assembled. At hour 21, a QRF responded to the team's observation point. 12 fighters moving fast, clearly tipped by a source they hadn't identified. The team had 90 seconds to displace. Marsh calmly called fire suppression on 3 approach routes. Simultaneously, a coordination sequence that, according to doctrine, required a 2-person team and a data link. She did it alone on a handheld radio in 40 seconds. The suppression bought the team 4 minutes. They displaced without contact. Hal Fitch said on the vehicle radio, once they were clear, because sometimes the only question is the shortest one. I pre-built the call packages for those routes on day 2, Marsh said. When the QRF activated, I just had to select and transmit. The preparation is 90% of it. The execution is just pulling the trigger on something you already loaded. Wycroft heard it and thought about her grandfather's rifle, which she'd rebuilt 3 times before getting it right, and how he used to tell her that the best shot is the one you took before you took it. The 1,000 hours of preparation that made the actual moment feel inevitable. Different skill, same principle. The debrief for the reconnaissance mission was the first time Wycroft heard Osei use the word exceptional in reference to a team member and mean it without qualifier. He said it looking at Marsh's coordination log, running his finger down the sequence of calls she'd made over 36 hours. Exceptional. Then he closed the folder and moved on, because that was how Osei was. Eckert didn't say anything during the debrief. Afterward, walking across the compound in the early morning, he fell into step beside Marsh. Wycroft watched from 15 meters back, close enough to observe, too far to hear. Whatever Eckert said made Marsh stop walking. He said something else. She nodded, once, a small motion. He extended his hand, which was not something Eckert did easily. She shook it. Then they walked away in different directions. And Wycroft was left with the understanding that something had been acknowledged between 2 professionals. In the private language, professionals use, when words aren't quite right for what needs to be said. She went to find her rifle, because that was what she did when she needed to think. Marsh was in the operations center 2 hours later, already working on the next terrain model, her coffee untouched beside her. Wycroft sat across from her. Eckert apologize? Something like that. He doesn't do that easily, I know. He told me he'd been in country 4 years, and he'd stopped being wrong about people. A small beat. He didn't like being wrong. Nobody does. He said he appreciated that I gave him something real to work from, that I didn't claim more than I could do. Marsh moved a notation on the terrain model. I told him that claiming more than you can do gets people killed, which is true in my specialty more than most. Wycroft thought about the 6% she'd admitted to in the planning briefing days ago, the honest number, the one no one expected her to give. Where'd you learn that? My dad. He never overstated what he knew about a piece of country. He said the land will correct you regardless, so you might as well be honest about it before the land has to. Marsh was quiet for a moment. He was right about most things. I'm still figuring out which ones. Wycroft looked at the terrain model between them, the valleys and ridges rendered in contour, the position she'd worked for days. It looked different now than it had 2 weeks ago, before she'd seen what Marsh could do with it. The same geography read at a different depth. You know what Irongate cost, Wycroft said. The extraction, 19 days for Aldridge. For us, 96 hours of planning, 1 hour of execution, and a result we'll write up as a success. It was a success. It was. But we almost ran a plan that would have failed 9 times out of 11. Marsh didn't say anything. That's not a critique, Wycroft said. It's an acknowledgement. We were close to something we couldn't see. You saw it. She paused. I don't like the idea that I couldn't see it. You would have found it, Marsh said. Eventually, the 72-hour war game would have surfaced the dead ground problem. Maybe. But you got there in 3 weeks, working alone from imagery. I'm not faster. I just see a different thing first. You see personnel, equipment, tactics. I see geography. Neither one is complete without the other. Wycroft understood she was being generous. She accepted it the way you accept accurate things said with kindness, without arguing. The 3rd mission came 8 days later, and it was the one that went wrong. Not catastrophically wrong. Not the kind of wrong that ends careers or fills body bags, but wrong in the specific way that tests whether the recovery is real or only theoretical, whether what you built in training holds when the conditions change without warning. The mission was a direct action, a raid on a known facilitator network. Marsh's role was fire coordination for the perimeter security element. The raid itself was Eckert's team. The perimeter was Wycroft and Negretti, with Marsh providing overwatch and coordination from an elevated position to the north. At the 40-minute mark, Marsh's radio went down. Not degraded, down. Complete failure. Hardware. Unrepairable in the field. Wycroft heard the silence where the coordination calls should have been and understood immediately what had happened. She had 6 seconds before Eckert's team made the initial breach and the operation became irrevocable. Marsh is off net, she said to Negretti. Negretti said a word not suitable for a debrief report. She'll find another way, Wycroft said, which was not certainty. It was a decision to act as if it were, which in the moment amounts to the same thing. What Marsh did was use signal mirror to communicate with Wycroft from her position, a technique that had not been used in field coordination since approximately 1978. She'd brought the mirror as part of a secondary kit she'd assembled 3 days prior, gear that no one else on the team carried, drawn from a contingency plan she'd never mentioned, because she didn't want to suggest she expected failure. The mirror signals were slow. They required Wycroft to interpret and relay. It added 15 seconds to every coordination call, which is an eternity in a running contact. But it worked. The raid completed. The perimeter held. The facilitator was captured, which was the objective. Negretti, relaying Marsh's signals for 38 minutes, looked like a man who'd run a marathon inside a phone booth. In the vehicle on the way back, Eckert turned around to look at Marsh. Signal mirror, secondary comms. You brought that as a contingency. I bring it on every operation. Eckert looked at Wycroft. She gave him nothing because she'd known before he asked. Who else on this team brings signal mirror as a secondary comms plan? He said. No one answered, which was the answer. The debrief for the third mission was quieter than the first two. People sat with what had happened, with the particular quality of silence that follows an operation you survived by a margin that was closer than you expected. OC asked his questions. The team answered them. Marsh gave her account without dramatizing and without minimizing, which was the same way she gave everything. Afterward, Wycroft found her in the equipment yard again, checking the mirror against its case, noting the edge wear. You could have told us about the contingency, Wycroft said. I could have. Why didn't you? Marsh thought about it. Because telling someone you've planned for the thing that's supposed to be impossible makes them think the impossible thing is more likely, which changes how they move, how they communicate, how they breathe. I needed the team operating as if the primary was reliable right up until it wasn't. Wycroft absorbed that. That's a lonely way to operate. Most of my work is internal, Marsh said, without self-pity. The part you see is small. She went back to checking the equipment. Wycroft stood and watched her for a while. The methodical checking, the complete attention to small things, and thought about what Marsh had said in the operations center. The only time it all makes sense. She understood that too. She understood it every time she settled behind the rifle and felt the world narrow to the scope's field of view, every variable resolved into something simple and true. One point, one breath, one moment of stillness before the result. Different entry points to the same place. Marsh. She looked up. Good work tonight. Marsh held her gaze for a moment. Thank you. It was a small exchange. In another unit, in another time, it might have meant nothing. But Wycroft had been in enough places to know that the small exchanges were where the real accounting happened, where people said what they meant because they were too tired for anything else. She went to clean her rifle. The night was going quiet around the phobe, the kind of quiet that meant the province was sleeping, which never lasted, but was always welcome. In 3 days, there would be another mission, another briefing, another terrain model on the table. Marsh working her contingencies in silence, while the team built its plan around her without fully understanding what they were building around. That was fine. The best support was the kind you didn't notice until it wasn't there. Wycroft field stripped the rifle in the dark by feel, the way her uncle had taught her on a kitchen table in Wyoming when she was 13. The metal was cold. The action was clean. She reassembled it without looking and ran the bolt twice, listening to the sound. Somewhere on the other side of the comm in the operations center, someone working late. Wycroft didn't have to check to know who it was. She put the rifle away and went to sleep, and in the morning they would start again.